An as-is addendum is often requested to be part of a contract. What does that mean for a buyer and a seller as part of that transaction? We'll talk about that coming up next. Hey, what's going on, friends? Nonaka here with the Buy Big Island video blog, and this week we're going to talk about as-is addendums. And especially in a hot market, you see a lot of sellers requesting that, and buyers sometimes get a little bit apprehensive about what does that mean, and do they want to sign an as-is addendum? What are the consequences for them if they do? And so there is a little bit of a misconception out there, and of course the most important thing is you actually read the addendum before you sign it so you understand what's in it. But I'm going to talk about some of the common misunderstandings about an as-is addendum and what it actually does. So the first thing is the as-is addendum basically says that the seller is selling the property as is, and the buyer is gonna accept it as is with no warranties, no obligations to make any repairs or credits or anything like that. And it doesn't absolve the seller of disclosing material facts. So if the seller knows of some material facts that would affect the property value, they do still have to disclose those things, but they're not making the sale with any type of warranty or representing that the roof isn't going to leak in the future or the electrical is not going to work, you're not going to have a plumbing break. If it's things that they don't know about, they're obviously not making any warranties going forward. And there's some other situations where it makes sense, where maybe it's a farm property, they're not guaranteeing any future return on the crops, or maybe it's a property that has the zoning to be subdivided. The seller is not going to be making any guarantees that you can do that in the future as a buyer, and the buyer has to accept that, right? They're not buying the property with a guarantee that they can do something with the land in the future that it currently isn't used for now. So those are very important aspects that do protect the seller in the future. But almost all properties have an as-is paragraph in the deed once the property is sold, so they have that coverage anyway without this addendum. But it does make a seller feel better sometimes having an as-is addendum, where they don't feel like they're going to have to do anything or make any repairs. And that's a common misconception. And buyers a lot of times have a similar misconception, where they're concerned that if they sign the as-is addendum and get under contract, they're not going to have the right to cancel if they find something in the inspection that is unacceptable. And that's definitely not the case. So a buyer still has the full right to do their home inspection, do any due diligence that they see necessary, and they can make a determination during their inspection period if they want to continue on with the sale of the property or the purchase of the property. It absolutely does not prevent the buyer from asking for a credit or a repair for something that they find during their due diligence. The seller is not obligated to accept those concessions, but the seller's never obligated to do that. So in every transaction, a buyer will do their due diligence, and if they find something that's unacceptable or that they want a credit for, or they want repaired, they can ask for it. The seller can always say no, and then the buyer still has the right to cancel. That is still the case with an as-is addendum. So it does not take away the buyer's right to do their due diligence and then cancel if they find something that is unacceptable or ask for a credit. For example, if you do your inspection and the washer and the dryer don't work, the washer and the dryer are parts of the contract as long as they're checked and included, and you don't have to accept as-is non-working appliances. You can ask for those appliances to be repaired. The seller, again, can say no, and then the buyer has to decide whether or not they want to continue on with the transaction. They can still cancel at that point. So, I often tell clients that an as-is addendum is somewhat useless because it doesn't change the fact. It does create some legal protections that a buyer can't sue a seller in the future if something that the seller did not know about breaks in the house or isn't acceptable to the buyer at some future date. But again, that is impossible to predict going forward in the future, and you're covered with an as-is clause in your title when you transfer title. So it's good to understand kind of the situations where an as-is addendum makes sense in a hot market right now. Sellers, a lot of times a buyer will offer up an as-is addendum to the seller as part of their contract to make it stronger, to say, look, I'm not going to ask you for anything. I'm not going to ask for any concessions or any credits. And they may feel like that maybe make the difference with their offer being stronger than somebody else's. But at the end of the day, it doesn't force a buyer to buy a property that they find to be unacceptable due to their inspection. And it definitely doesn't ensure that a seller isn't going to have to make any repairs or do any credits, especially if it's something that have to do with an appraisal or health and safety. So a lot of times appraisers will require straps on a water heater. Very simple fix that you can do yourself or a handyman can do for a very low cost. Are you really gonna let the deal cancel because the buyer is asking for you to add seismic straps on your water heater, which is required by the code and will be required for an appraisal to be accepted? You're not gonna let that deal fall apart because of that, and so you still have to consider things like that to make a deal go through. So again, if you have any questions, make sure you read that As-Is Addendum clearly so you understand what's in it and you're getting good advice and you're using it when it's appropriate, and you are not misunderstanding what it means and potentially causing issues in your transaction that are unnecessary, because you can still get through them and solve those problems. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments or hit me up at Dylan at buybigisland.com, and I'll see you guys next week. Aloha.